An over-indebted system, but kind of by definition, can't take care of all the people it used to take care of back when it wasn't over-indebted. And the people who aren't being taken care of get angry and they make demands. And that's what you're seeing around the world in the civil unrest that's taking place out there, is the government will frequently cave and give people back what it took to make them go into the streets. In other words, it'll cut gas prices or do away with an extradition law like in Hong Kong that had everybody upset. But then the protesters don't stop. So, which tells you it wasn't really that issue. They're just mad, and they want the system to go back to the way it was when it worked for them. The banks and the central banks and the central governments of the world aren't even really separate entities anymore. They're all kind of divisions in one big organization, whose main goal is to increase power and scope and latitude for action. So when I say I hope the government is smart enough to see that this is the end of the road for the current system and go on to something better in a peaceful way, I'm talking about all of those guys together. The banks and the central bankers and the government would have to sit down together and say, okay, we basically have milked these guys for everything we're going to get out of them, all right? And, if we try to push this any further, they're going to come and they're going to pull us out of our offices and do who knows what. It's going to be a French Revolution kind of scenario. And we don't want that because we're already super rich. How much richer do we need to be? Let's protect our wealth by going back to sound money, the whole bail-in thing. See, that's another risk where your bank gets into trouble. And instead of just bailing out the bank, the government comes in and takes 20% of everybody's account and gives it to the bank. And that's what they're doing in Europe for various reasons. And that might be what we do here, because bailing out the big banks is, in retrospect, a really unpopular policy. And if they try to do it again, they may not succeed politically. So they might have to do the whole bail-in thing. And then, then you lose both ways. The dollar gets less valuable and you have fewer dollars in your bank account, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, just don't keep too many dollars in a bank account. You need some cash in order to cover day-to-day expenses. So have some cash on hand or very accessible. And then with what else you should have had, or what you would have had in dollars, put it in real assets, things that governments can't make more of.
Welcome back to Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest. John Rubino is the founder of dollarcollapse.com. Today is Monday, November 18th, 2019. John, thanks for joining us here.
Hey, Donegan. Congratulations on your expanding empire. You've got multiple shows now.
Huh? Yeah. So now I get to upload twice as many places. But actually, it's a really great thing because we were a longtime supporter and partners with Finance and Liberty Channel. They were supporting us from the very beginning. And some of their supporters, such as Carrie Letts from the Financial Survival Network, who had helped them get started, helped us get started. So it was a very collaborative relationship for like 5 years. So it was a natural fit because a lot of our audience members and theirs have similar concerns about what they see happening in our macro financial and economic situation, and they don't want to be caught unaware. So we're just trying to carry on their mission and ours, and that's helping people be aware and prepared and to protect their finances and their liberty. So it really does all come together.
Good.
Hey, we wanted to get back with you. It's been too long, and you've been traveling a lot, and we finally caught you not traveling for a moment, so here we are, and we wanted to get back with you and get an update from you. We have several hot topics to touch and then some viewers' questions we can field with your permission. If we can first look at one aspect of concern that's going on around the world, and that's these sort of geopolitical hotspots with lots of civil unrest in various places, from Hong Kong to other places. And if you could maybe tell us what you think are the major factors. Are these all just, randomly, just like weather? Sometimes you'll get a lot of events all happening around the same time, or is there more to it, some patterns of similarity, some threads that we should be aware of that are driving all these civil unrest hotspots at this time?
Well, there's always a background level of civil unrest in the world. Somebody's rioting for some reason somewhere, pretty much every day. But lately, we've gotten into double digits. You look at Latin America, you got Ecuador and Argentina and Venezuela, and now Chile, which is a huge surprise because that's this really stable middle class country with a lot of natural resources and an insane coastline, all that beachfront property that you never hear about. And all of a sudden, they're in a state of emergency because people are in the streets. And then Hong Kong and Lebanon and in Iraq, the soldiers are firing into crowds and killing lots of people. And in Iran, people are in the streets protesting fuel price increases. And I think the common thread among these things is that there really is no common thread on the first cause. In other words, different things are sending people into the streets. But I think the underlying cause is the same everywhere, which is rising inequality due to easy money and excessive debt. And you've got people around the world in many different countries who are seeing what they thought of was upward mobility in the past just evaporating. They're not progressing anymore, and they're regressing in a lot of cases. And meanwhile, you got this really arrogant 1% super rich class that doesn't seem to be subject to any of the same laws that everyone else is. And in a society where you've got prospects, you can get a raise at work and you can get a promotion or you can get a degree and do something more interesting. You accept inequality of wealth and income. But as soon as you can't take your family to the next level, or you can't even hold your current level, then the world stops being benign to you, and you're likely to take the streets as the only way to affect any kind of a change. And so we're seeing that all over the world. Even in Germany right now, farmers are blocking main roads into and out of, I think it's Dusseldorf, but don't quote me on that, because of environmental regulations that they perceive to be hurting their businesses. So everybody seems to be feeling the same thing. And in the US, of course, there's a perception that that's the case here too, where the 1% is basically harvesting the 99%. And when you look at easy money, extremely easy money, in other words, super low interest rates and massive government deficits and aggressive money creation by the central bank, that's either an accidental help for the 1% or a purposeful way of sucking wealth out of the middle and lower classes and giving it to the richest people. Because when you lower interest rates dramatically, or you create a lot of new currency and dump it into the banking sector, that money flows first and foremost into financial assets like stocks and bonds and expensive, usually financed assets like real estate. And who owns that? The rich people already own most of the stocks and bonds of real estate. So when you ease financial conditions, you enrich them first. Meanwhile, you make it harder and harder to save because you can't earn any money on your bank account if you're somebody who's working at their job and trying to put a little bit away so they don't have to sleep in their kid's guest room in 20 years. And so people in the US now, and in most of the developed world, are starting to perceive themselves as being screwed over coming and going. In other words, they can't make anything on their savings. And the rich are getting richer because of government policies, the same government policies that are making it hard for regular people to make any money on their savings. So it wouldn't be a surprise to see some of the stuff that's happening around the world happening in the US in the next couple of years, maybe after the next election, because whoever loses next time around is going to feel cheated, right? Whether it's the right or the left. They're going to look for reasons to see the result as illegitimate and to believe that it was stolen from them. And that, you take extreme wealth inequality and then a political grievance, put those two together and you have a recipe for trouble. And we could see that.
The other thing that you made me think of along the way when you're talking about these economic strains that the middle class are under is like we ain't seen nothing yet, because the interest rates, what we're told going forward, are going to be driving even more in the same direction and towards negative than they have. And we haven't even had to pay the piper yet for the taxes to pay for all this debt. Because when people talk about, government spending, government doesn't have any money. They're nobody. They're just we voted them in. They didn't. It's just a fiction that exists because we created it so that we could have some order. But it's our money, and it hasn't the paying of those bills by the ordinary earners and their children and their grandchildren, and that just seems like it's when you talk about people realizing that they're getting screwed over, the amount of injustice when people really realize that the reason they can't get ahead is because a bigger and bigger and bigger slice of anything that they earn is going to pay for these egregious taxes that are going to have to increase going forward, are they not?
Yeah, as long as you include inflation in the category of taxes, I totally agree. Because what we'll more than likely have to do, because we're running government deficits at levels last seen during the depths of the Great Recession when we were in a crisis. Now we're 10 years into an expansion and we're running $1 trillion deficits. Meanwhile, auto loans are at record levels, corporate loans are at record levels, student loans are at record levels, credit cards are up, mortgages, it just goes on and on. We're borrowing money at every level of this society. And all of that has to be paid back at some point. So the way traditionally the governments do that is that they make their currency worth less. And that allows everyone to pay back their debts in cheaper currency. In other words, it makes debts manageable. But what that also does is makes savings less valuable. So that's the price that we'll pay, and that's the tax that will be levied on us more than likely. Our savings will become much less valuable, and the difference between what it was and what it is will basically be shipped off to the government to pay its debts and to debtors to pay back their debts more easily. So that's yet another divide that we're creating in society between savers and borrowers. The old ant versus the grasshopper story.
Well, that's one of the themes that came out just recently from Christine Lagarde, the newly appointed head of the European Central Bank, saying that we should be grateful to have our jobs, if not our savings, because of the negative interest rates policy started by her predecessor Mario Draghi. They're basically going to be dipping into and pulling money out of not just inflating away secretly and in a cowardly way from people's savings, but actually pulling money out of people's accounts through negative interest rates. And anyway, I brought it up with a couple of other guests recently, but it just burns, and I imagine it does to people who really think that through as far as what that means to the ordinary person.
Oh yeah, it was an amazing statement, but it was a central banker telling the truth, right, which makes it kind of interesting, because you don't really get the truth from these guys very often. And she flat out said, we had to sacrifice your savings in order to keep people at work. And going forward, as you said, that's how the tax will be levied. Your bank account will shrink by 1 or 2 or 3% a year. And that 1 or 2 or 3% will go to somebody else. So there are a lot of reasons for grievance in a world like this. And that's just how it works when you take on too much money. An over-indebted system, but kind of by definition, can't take care of all the people it used to take care of back when it wasn't over-indebted. And the people who aren't being taken care of get angry and they make demands. And that's what you're seeing around the world in the civil unrest that's taking place out there, is the government will frequently cave and give people back what it took to make them go into the streets. In other words, it'll cut gas prices or do away with an extradition law like in Hong Kong that had everybody upset. But then the protesters don't stop. So, which tells you it wasn't really that issue. They're just mad, and they want the system to go back to the way it was when it worked for them. But you can't do that because the only tool that central banks and over-indebted governments have is easier money to keep the thing growing and to keep catastrophe from happening. So the fact that easy money is what got us into this, it disadvantages savers and helps the already rich. And the secondary fact that that's the only tool we have left going forward means that the people in the streets can't get what they want. They can't turn the clock back to the way it was back when you got 7% on a bank account and you got 3 or 4% raises at work. You can't go back to that. What will happen instead is that the things that are frustrating them will get worse. Interest rates will go down even further, and jobs will pay less in real terms going forward than they do now. So, you might find yourself working as an Uber driver. And even if you manage to save anything, the savings shrink over time. So what's the point of your life as it is now structured? So why not, join a big crowd, and grab your metaphorical pitchforks and torches and go to the castle and demand that the baron give you some of his land. That's repeated throughout history. And basically, we're just seeing the serfs rise up again here.
You mentioned people feeling disenfranchised no matter which way the next U.S. election goes, for example, in 2020. But how much of that, given the backdrop of the reality of what you're saying, there's a saying, the topic is never the issue when it comes to arguments between people. If the issue is more underlying and it's this huge structural grinding disparity that's just eliminating the middle class, how does it make any difference? Like, we have this whole big flap going on right now about the presidential impeachment or not, that kind of thing. And many commentators have criticized the attention that's being lavished on this by the press as just a sideshow to distract us that the right wing and the left wing, the Team Blue and Team Red are all playing the same game, and we're getting this deterioration of people's prospects and the ability to really prosper with their family. Has been happening under all kinds of administrations going forward. So can you talk to us a little bit about the presidential impeachment process and whether you see that as jugular to something that's vital to the character of our nation and something that's really important, or is it just a distraction to get people's mind off of the fact that their futures and their children's are being taken away from them?
Well, it's a sign of how far gone we are politically now, because the Democrats were always going to try to get rid of Donald Trump. Congress hasn't passed a single law that I know of in the last couple of years. They've done nothing substantively positive. But they did the Mueller report for 2 years, the Mueller investigation, thinking that would help them get rid of Donald Trump. And when that turned out to be nothing, they fell back on something that is just sad, this weird little saga in the Ukraine where Trump strong-armed the president of the Ukraine in order to get him to investigate Joe Biden, or something that 99.99% of the people who are told about it don't understand. Furthermore, what they're doing is only in Congress right now, and as soon as it gets to the Senate, which is run by Republicans, it'll die regardless. So none of this makes any difference. And it's just sad for the Democrats. Here's how sad it is, the Democrat strategy right now. The Republicans are actually thinking about instituting a impeachment procedure in the Senate as a way of tying up the government during the Democrat primaries, so that if they have an impeachment program going on in the Senate, the senators who are running for president, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they can't go campaign. They have to be in the Senate for impeachment. And so that screws up the Democrat primary and maybe gives Joe Biden a chance of winning, because I think that's who Trump would probably love to run against. Biden is perceived as being a really weak candidate in a lot of ways, and Trump thinks he will just cut him to shreds. And the Democrats gave the Republicans this opening. The Republicans really can start impeachment proceedings in the Senate if they want to. And if they do that, that ties the Democrats up without ever resolving anything, because the Republicans can just close it down whenever they want to. When they feel like they've done enough damage to the Democrats, they'll just close down the impeachment thing. They don't have to keep it going. And the Democrats are so dumb that they put themselves in this position. So yeah, and now the important thing to understand about this, other than the minutia of the kind of inside baseball strategy and everything, is that it's what you expect when you take on too much debt. In other words, an over-indebted financial system leads to a crazy political system, which in turn makes finance more stressful, which makes politics more stressful. And you get this feedback loop where politics and finance feed off of each other until everything spins out of control. And we are well into that right now. The fact that we elected Donald Trump last time around speaks to the chaos in our political system. The fact that we might elect Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist, next time around means that the middle is gone in American politics. And we've basically just got the fringes now. And fringe populists tend to create chaos wherever they go. There's the occasional good idea in a populist platform, but usually it's really underdeveloped and it's impracticable, and it just ends up creating chaos rather than stability like people want. And that's what we're headed for. Now, governments respond to chaos with more spending and easier money. So you see where this is going. The easy money causes people to be frustrated enough to vote for fringe candidates. Fringe candidates come in, cause chaos. That leads the government to either cut taxes or dramatically increase spending, or both, and the central bank to cut interest rates and pump a lot of money into the banking system, which further frustrates the people who see their savings get less valuable and watch the rich people get even richer, and until the system craters somehow. And that's really the question. What does cratering mean in this context? What's the end game here? And I think there's there are several scenarios. And the most optimistic one is the monetary reset, where some Sunday night, the government just announces, okay, henceforth, the dollar is just a name for 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. We're back on a gold standard, and we will only create enough money to match the increase in our gold reserves, no more. And so from then on, we're on a stable monetary regime. But we have to get through the fact that blew up the savings of everybody who trusted the government and held dollars, because dollars are in effect devalued by 60 or 70% in the math that I just laid out. That's the optimistic scenario. The less optimistic scenarios are a 1930s style depression where everybody goes bankrupt and we get rid of the debt through default, or a 1920s-ish Weimar Republic kind of hyperinflation where the value of the currency plunges in an uncontrolled way because nobody wants to hold it anymore. And that is as chaotic as anything you can imagine. Hyperinflation in the world's reserve currency is almost inconceivable. But the numbers are pointing us in that direction at some point in the future in some form. And so we're looking at something like that. And the question is, how wise will the government be when the time comes? Can they just recognize that it's game over for fiat currencies and do the monetary reset and go back to some kind of a fixed regime monetary standard? Or are we going to ride this thing all the way to the end because the people in charge don't want to give up power? Which I get, the power to make money out of thin air. That would be hard to let go of. And that's what they would have to let go of if they went from a pure fiat currency regime like we have now to some kind of a gold standard or something like that, or a crypto standard, something where the government can't make money out of thin air anymore.
Well, that last scenario you were talking about supposes that the government per se has been the ones calling the shots, making the decisions, and putting together the strategy. But there are several voices who've been saying for some time that no, in this runaway debt, you can certainly look at it from the government standpoint of saying, if I'm a politician and I can figure out a way to make easy money policies and giveaways and entitlement programs and stuff, it reinforces it ingratiates the populace with me and it reinforces my power. They're going to vote for me, that kind of thing. So you can understand how that could be a conflict of interest there. But in the bigger picture, with nation after nation all around the world borrowing themselves into oblivion, it's not clear that it's the governments who are coming out the winners rather than just being the executives that are enacting a policy that's being set by those who are actually benefiting, which it seems like would be the lenders, the banks to whom everyone is becoming beholden. I don't mean to be conspiracy theorist, but in that model, if you watch the money and say who's benefiting from this, is it not the lenders that are benefiting the most from this runaway debting around the world and all the sovereign nations?
Yeah, the banks have taken over the global governance lately, and I think you can make the case that the banks and the central banks and the central governments of the world aren't even really separate entities anymore. They're all kind of divisions in one big organization whose main goal is to increase power and scope and latitude for action. So when I say I hope the government is smart enough to see that this is the end of the road for the current system and go on to something better in a peaceful way. I'm talking about all of those guys together. The banks and the central bankers and the government would have to sit down together and say, okay, we basically have milked these guys for everything we're going to get out of them, all right? And, if we try to push this any further, they're going to come and they're going to pull us out of our offices and do who knows what. It's going to be a French Revolution kind of scenario. And we don't want that because we're already super rich. How much richer do we need to be? Let's protect our wealth by going back to sound money. There's an analyst named Catherine Austin Fitts that has a very well thought out scenario in which what she calls the breakaway culture, which is the super rich who have the best technology and the best business plans and all the good assets and who are accelerating away from the rest of us. When they finally say, okay, we've stolen enough, now let's go back to sound money so we can protect what we have. And that's kind of, unfortunately, that's the best case scenario because it's relatively peaceful. But it wouldn't be a surprise when you put it that way, to think that maybe it's a reasonable thing to have happen because they really have stolen enough, and maybe they recognize that. Well, and with peace forward, instead of having to live in a bunker in New Zealand while the world spins out of control, maybe they would like to keep their Upper West Side penthouse and live in a sound money world, and I would, if I was a billionaire, I'd be looking to protect the system rather than to drive it off a cliff, I guess, just in my own self-interest. So hopefully that's the thought process that goes forward, because the other scenarios are just too crazy to think about.
Well, let's take a moment and look at what we're seeing in either the equity markets, the stocks and bonds and so on, because we certainly have a divergence of analysts who are lining up on either side of a big chasm saying, we are at the end game. This thing is just going to collapse. We're at the bubble of all bubbles, and all it takes is a pinprick of any kind. This whole derivatives house is going to come tumbling down, and this whole thing pulls down. Other people saying, nope, this is not only is it the longest expansion in history, but now that the Fed is, and all the Federal Reserves of the central banks of the world have got this fiat debt thing figured out, now we can just launch into another expansion. So, Dow is on its way to 36,000 and on, here we go. What direction, how much viability does either of these worldviews have? Is it possible that either one of these could play out, and the poor little guy in the middle going, the casino just seems like it's spinning out of control, but can it just keep doing that for an extended period of time?
Well, they both have a point, because we're at valuation levels in basically any category of any financial asset that in the past has preceded a giant crash. In other words, we're really overvalued if you look at stocks, certainly bonds, and definitely real estate. In the past, when they got this expensive, there was a crash and they lost 30, 40, 50, 60% of their value. So it's easy to see that happening again, just because that's the way it's played out throughout history. And if that's your take, then you want to be shorting everything in sight right now, right? You want to be mortgaging the house and shorting all the big tech stocks, and then the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, and basically any index, any big stock, just short them all, and then you've got a big short kind of scenario where once it plays out, you get very rich, because shorting is usually a leveraged process. And if you're right, you make some big multiple of what you risked. Now, the other side of the argument is that, it's a mess here, but it's a bigger mess out there. So capital from all over the world is going to be flowing into the U.S. Because I think about it, if you're a Brazilian millionaire and you're looking at what's happening in Chile on one side and Argentina on the other side, and Ecuador over there and Venezuela over there, and you've elected a guy who is sort of a proto-fascist or something, and you want to get out of there. And if you have to pay double the 5-year-ago price for a Miami condo in order to park your cash, maybe you want to do that. And same thing if you're in China, same thing if you're in Russia. Those places, and certainly same thing if you're in Europe. Those places are not stable, and your money is at risk if you leave it there. So maybe you just move it over to the U.S. and pay what you have to pay to be here, just because we're marginally less likely to descend into absolute chaos. And so maybe you pay whatever the stock price is at a given time if you want to buy an S&P 500 index, or if you want to buy Google or Apple or whatever, you just pay, just buy it, whatever. And that pushes the price of those things way up, along with San Francisco real estate, New York City real estate, farmland, whatever else foreign capital might want to buy. And so we have a boom driven by foreign capital flowing in here because we are the last system standing. And that's also possible. So it's really frustrating because usually at this point in a cycle, it's pretty clear you just want to be shorting everything in sight and then ride that thing back down, because it's a bubble. Bubbles always burst. So bet on that bubble bursting, and maybe you'll be a year or two too early, but in the end, you'll be right in a big way. That's possible, but you can't say with the kind of certainty that we were able to say that in past bubbles. So I wish I could be more help.
Well, no, I mean, I think you've outlined cases that could go either way. It's been interesting. There's a third path you didn't talk about, and that is what we've been reading about in a couple articles recently about either high net worth individuals and families and funds and so on sitting on cash because so many entities that are watching this market don't know which way it's going to go, but want to be able to jump in if it's going to go up or jump on it if it's going to go down in either direction. So not placing their bets yet, but sitting largely in cash more than any time in the past decade. Is that a phenomenon that you imagine will persist until we get a clear direction which is the way this thing's going?
Well, cash is part of the first scenario where the bubble eventually bursts, because smart money pulls out of overvalued assets and sells them to the dumb money that comes in later, which means by definition, the smart money is raising cash, right? So you see Warren Buffett do that in every cycle where these stories come out and say, whoa, Warren Buffett has $112 billion of cash because he can't find anything to buy. And other smart investors do the same thing. And then when the system breaks down, or when the market breaks down and everything gets way cheap, they jump in with their cash and buy things at the bottom. In the housing bubble, when it burst, who bought all the houses? Private equity companies who had raised huge amounts of cash for that purpose. And so the biggest landlords in the country now are on Wall Street. And the same thing could easily happen this time around, where people who pay attention to valuation just say, well, I can't find anything that meets my criteria, therefore I'm going to have a lot of cash. And they sit it out until things get cheaper again. Now, it could be that their cash is replaced by foreign cash. And then you've got the second scenario where a tidal wave of Chinese money comes in and Russian money and European money, and that more than offsets the smart money selling. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's a good answer for this one, just because we're in a unique situation. The whole world has borrowed so much money, and everybody's politics is so unpredictable that old valuation measures are not necessarily the really good indicators of the near-term future that they used to be. And it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that there are other things to consider and other scenarios that are also possible. So this might be another one of those things where diversification is the way to go. Maybe you go long the things that seem undervalued and you short the things that seem overvalued, and hope that your judgment about relative valuation is sound. And then doesn't matter what happens, you make the spread between those two things if you're right. So a long short fund might be something that would be useful in that kind of a situation, but I really don't know.
It seems that we should talk about, when we talk about bubble assets, there's, as Gregory Mannarino mentions, there's inverse bubbles too. Particularly, he talks about precious metals as being in an inverse bubble. We have a question from a viewer with the last name Kako who says, why is the price of silver still under $20? Is it because there's no demand for physical silver bullion from institutional investors? Do they only buy silver derivatives contracts like futures, ETFs, or SLV? Or is it because most institutional investors are still big institutional short sellers of silver, for example? What do you think is going on with the remaining lack of runaway price, as has happened with stocks, to precious metals?
Yeah, I think precious metals are really almost the only thing you can point to now and say they're relatively cheap, and silver much more so than gold. On one level, it's a mystery because basically the things that have soared are the things that rich people buy with their extra money when they've already bought several houses and a yacht and a plane, and they're eating all the food they can eat. What do you do with the extra money when it keeps coming in from the Fed? They buy assets like Van Goghs and London penthouses and large cap equities. And they also usually buy gold and silver. But this time around, they're not so much. Although central banks are suddenly net buyers of gold. So we're seeing demand come from a new sector there. Now, silver hasn't really gotten caught up in that yet. Gold is at record levels in most countries against most currencies, just not in the US against the dollar yet. But it's headed up now. It's been rising for the last year. And if it keeps going up, then here's the dynamic if gold keeps going up. People will think, oh, I should buy some gold, it's rising. And then they'll look at what it costs and say, God, one little coin is going to cost me $1,700? That doesn't seem reasonable. And then they think, well, what else can I buy that's like that? Oh, look at all the silver I can get for that $1,700. I can't even carry $1,700 worth of silver, and so they buy silver, and that pushes the price of silver up more dramatically than gold is rising. So you get the gold to silver ratio start to compress. And that's the way these cycles work. You start out with a gold to silver ratio. In other words, gold is like 80 times as expensive as silver.
Currently.
It takes, that's kind of where it goes in each cycle, around there. This time it went into the 90s briefly, which means silver got super cheap compared to gold. And then as gold goes up and silver goes up faster, the gold to silver ratio declines until it's 30, 40, 20, something like that, which means silver has gone up about twice as fast as gold, twice as much as gold in percentage terms. And I would expect to see that again. It isn't happening as fast as it ought to, but I would think that we will see something similar happen this time around. But you're going to need gold to go up in a way that catches Americans' attention. So we need it to break $1,600, $1,700, which it could easily do. I mean, another year like last year, and we're at $1,800. So that can totally happen. And then it becomes a headline thing and a momentum thing, and all kinds of people who weren't paying attention before get in, and we're back off to the races again. So that will happen, and it'll happen. I can guarantee that it'll happen at some point because the world's governments are borrowing way too much money and the world's central banks are creating way too much money, and that extra cash has to go somewhere. And yes, it's gone into fine art and real estate and blue chip equities so far. But as those things get more and more overvalued, gold and silver look relatively better and better. And at some point, the money notices that, the hot money notices it and starts piling into precious metals. You're getting some mainstream money managers talk about this now, like Ray Dalio, for instance, who's a big bond fund manager, is now talking about the average portfolio probably needing to be 10% in gold, which would be an astounding amount of money flowing into gold if that happened, because the average portfolio is maybe 1% gold right now. And there probably isn't enough gold in the world to satisfy a shift of global capital in general from 1% to 10% in precious metals. You just couldn't get gold anymore if you tried to do that. And that would send silver through the roof. You'd see $5,000 gold and $200 silver just based on that perceptual shift in the global investing community. And that's before the panic sets in of the currency crisis that's out there. So it's coming. This stuff is kind of baked into the financial cake just because of the mistakes we're making. And the real question is the timing. When does it happen? And that's unpredictable. But it does feel like the momentum is building now, based on gold being at record levels in most countries and being at a recent high. It's at a 5 or 6 year high in the US. So there's upward momentum. We're at the end of a long down cycle. Governments and most other big financial players are making huge mistakes. It's a good environment for precious metals. So I would think that the next few years are way better than the last few years for gold and silver.
We have a related question, but this is on the fiat side. Jocko John asks, if there is going to be a reset of the U.S. fiat currency, and would that reset destroy the value of your lifetime savings in a bank or credit union, what might that look like?
Well, yeah, if they were to devalue the dollar to 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold, your savings, if you have a dollar bank account, your savings would be less valuable proportionately, right? So then it becomes a question of, does the government step in and bail you out by increasing the dollars in your bank account by a commensurate amount? Which means they have to borrow a huge amount of new money, which violates the terms of their new monetary system. So it gets into a really tricky set of issues for these guys. Because if you wipe out 2/3 of everybody's bank account, then we're going to talk civil unrest in a big way, mostly from the middle class, because it won't hurt somebody who doesn't have any savings. And it'll probably help people who own a lot of different assets, some of which will go up in value when the dollar goes down. But it's the middle class who has most of their savings in literal savings accounts or bank CDs or things like that, or bond funds, who are hurt worse. And so that's one of the tricky parts of the whole monetary reset scenario. How do you keep the people that you're hurting by doing this from absolutely losing it? And it's not clear how you do it, but that would be the challenge for governments, because yes, your savings would shrink. And unless your paycheck goes way up in dollar terms, your take-home pay would shrink in that kind of a scenario. And you will not be happy about that. And you'll make your unhappiness known, and the government has to deal with it. So there's that issue. But once you're through that issue, 2 weeks later, you're operating with a sound monetary system that can go forward without inflation and without all the corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, the details have yet to be worked out for the monetary reset. And the big risk is that if you have a bank account that's in dollars, you're hurt by it. So, you know what? You shouldn't have all your money in dollars anyhow. You should not be owning fiat currency. Gold and silver tend to go up over time against dollars and euros and yen. So treat precious metals as your cash savings and expect them to hold their purchasing power over long periods of time, just like they've done. In 1971, gold was $35 an ounce. In 2000, it was $280 an ounce. Now it's $1,400 and change. It has more than held its value versus the dollar over that time. And expect that to happen in the future. And that protects you against this whole monetary reset, quasi-hyperinflation scenario. Because, even if we don't have the monetary reset, like I said, we can still have ongoing inflation where the currency gets less and less valuable year after year. And you don't want to own a lot of dollars through that either. So precious metals are great as insurance. Even if they don't go up next year, you're still buying long-term insurance against monetary insanity. And that's very valuable insurance based on what could happen and what has happened in other places.
We have a related question that follows on to here from Daniel McCarville, who asks, I'm in California. How can I get a large portion of my remaining cash out of my bank? It's a local California bank. Should I withdraw in increments? How much at a time won't be a red flag?
Yeah, okay. Moving large amounts of cash around is a tricky thing. And that's probably something that I shouldn't give advice about, because if I'm wrong in any way and somebody goes out there and does it and commits a crime accidentally because I said to do it, that I don't want that to happen. But
sure.
What you want to do before you move large amounts of cash is research the applicable laws and find out exactly what you can and can't do and what the consequences of one thing versus another thing are, and then adhere strictly to the law. Because the last thing you want to do is become a criminal while just trying to protect the purchasing power of your savings.
Just trying not to get done in by the criminals.
Yeah. Because then you're opening yourself up to the guys who would love to clean out your bank account, but just can't do it right this minute. But civil forfeiture is still the law in a lot of places, where if you do something that they think is wrong, they can take everything you've got on you and don't have to give it back, even if they don't prosecute you. That is the law in a lot of places. So you need to be very careful about, for instance, driving around with a bunch of cash in your car.
Yep.
Or, buying something for cash. The government wants to know, why didn't you pay with a credit card that we can track you? through. So, yeah, just be really careful. I can't give you specific advice, but find out what the law is and adhere to it strictly, even if it costs you some money, because the alternative is much worse.
You might get a clue. We had a video on our Reluctant Preppers channel called Insider Tips for Dealing with a Coin Exchange. If you look that one up, you'll see some tips about the mandatory reporting requirements that they have, and your local bank has mandatory reporting limits as well. So by checking into those things, you can search that online as well. It can help you stay out of harm's way there. We have again a related question from RV Spirit Breaker, who asks, in a collapse/reevaluation/reset scenario, what happens to personal debts?
Well, in the ideal situation, if you owe money, your debts evaporate, right? Because you're paying, let's say you have a $100,000 debt and the dollar is devalued by 2/3, your real debt becomes 35 or so $1,000 in effect, so they help you and they hurt savers. Now, they're going to be under a lot of pressure to help savers and to try to keep lenders whole. So it's possible that they change the contracts out there, basically index them. So if the dollar goes down by 35% or 60% or whatever, your loan is adjusted, the principal of your loan is adjusted, or the interest rate on your loan is adjusted to put you back to even, make it like it was before the devaluation. And that sounds crazy, but crazy stuff happens when you're dealing with this kind of financial leverage and this kind of political and financial instability. So that's conceivable. I think in general, borrowers are going to end up better off than savers are in any kind of a situation where the dollar has to be devalued one way or another. And, I wouldn't want to say borrow all the money you can, because that's another thing where it might not work, and that's therefore bad advice if it doesn't work. But in general, if I had a big home mortgage right now, I would see it as either a winning situation or a neutral situation. In other words, I'm not going to be worse off with the dollar devaluation, and I might be much better off if they just let my loan in real terms shrink by 2/3. So I would be okay with having really good quality debt, but I would never, ever go out and just borrow a lot of money based on some assumption about what's going to happen in the financial markets in the future. Because, if you can't pay your interest and principal, then you lose everything, and you don't even have your savings anymore. So, again, none of this stuff is guaranteed. Therefore, every scenario is kind of a percentage bet. And yeah, a lot of this stuff will happen if the government allows it to happen, and it won't if it doesn't. And but all the broad financial forces are moving towards lower currency values and more financial instability. So just as a general thesis, it's probably a good idea to set up your life so that those are things that you're protecting yourself against. And, it's a book length subject, how exactly that you do that. But gold and silver are traditional things that have helped, and other real assets like well-chosen farmland and a nice rental house in a stable market. Those are the kind of things that tend to do well over time in periods of financial instability. So that's the investment advice I would give. Don't go out and borrow a ton of money based on this, because that's a speculation that might work out, but emphatically might not work out. But do try to own real assets paid for with cash to the extent possible.
I think you might have answered Tammy Watts' question. She says, what do you think the odds are of bank bail-ins, and what would you recommend doing with a substantial amount of cash sitting in the bank? Buy tangible assets like real estate, even if they are in a bubble. And again, we're not giving direct financial advice here. We're giving principles that people need to be aware of to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I forgot about the whole bail-in thing. See, that's another risk where your bank gets into trouble, and instead of just bailing out the bank, the government comes in and takes 20% of everybody's account and gives it to the bank. And that's what they're doing in Europe for various reasons. And that might be what we do here, because bailing out the big banks is, in retrospect, a really unpopular policy. And if they try to do it again, they may not succeed politically. So they might have to do the whole bail-in thing. And then, then you lose both ways. The dollar gets less valuable and you have fewer dollars in your bank account and there's nothing you can do about it. So, just don't keep too many dollars in a bank account. You need some cash in order to cover day-to-day expenses. So have some cash on hand or very accessible. And then with what else you should have had or what you would have had in dollars, put it in real assets. Things that governments can't make more of, because that's really the kind of bifurcation that happens in markets like this. The things governments can make more of, they make more of. And the value of each individual one of those things goes down. The things they can't make more of tend to go up in value because there's just what there is. There's, as the old saying goes, God isn't going to make any more beachfront property. And that's true of a lot of assets out there in the world, where there just aren't going to be any more than there are right now, or there will only be a little bit more than there are right now. Those things will hold their value over time. So you want to skew your financial life towards things like that and away from stuff that governments can just destroy with the click of a mouse.
We've talked about the specter of negative interest rates, which have already surfaced in Europe and in Japan, for example. But Couch Potato Kennedy asks, in what way will the path towards negative rates eventually create a systemic risk?
Okay, well, lower interest rates, especially negative interest rates, destroy people's savings. And then capitalism doesn't work anymore, right? If there are no savings, there's no investable capital. And interest rates stop sending price signals to entrepreneurs in the market, so nobody knows how to invest their capital, so you get malinvestment, which means the economy doesn't work very well anymore. At the same time, you get a lot of people who aren't making any money off their savings anymore and are deeply frustrated. So you get the political stuff we talked about. You get the corruption of capitalism that we haven't really talked about, but that's what happens when you have malinvestment. When people don't know where to put their money and they make big mistakes because the market's not telling them the right thing anymore. And you get absolute political chaos. So add all that up, and it's a huge systemic risk that derives from excessively easy money. So negative interest rates are sort of the face of that policy. But there are also massive fiscal deficits and aggressive money creation and quantitative easing. All of these things are in the same category of really bad ideas. And the systemic risks that flow from them are basically the things we started out in this talk covering. You get people in the streets rioting and forcing the government to aggressively ease even further, which makes everything worse. And, it just goes on until the system spins out of control. And we're not far from that, really, because the numbers are already impossible and they're only going to get more impossible. And the investment thesis that flows from that to deal with these systemic risks are what we talked about also, real assets, things like that.
Well, John, you've been generous with us. It's been great to have you back on Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers. If people want to find out more of your work, where can they catch up with you?
I run dollarclaps.com, which covers a lot of this stuff and has a free mailing list where you give me your email address and you'll get everything that I publish on that site in your email box.
Great. We want to remind everyone that if you find that the guests we've been bringing you and the topics we've been breaking open for you are providing value in your life, helping you to be aware and prepared, you can help support us, because that's what's necessary so we can keep bringing these to you by going to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. And if you can start out at a $10 per month donation, it will really make our mission possible here to help cover our expenses so we can keep doing this. And we want to thank John Rubino, our guest, for being with us. John, thanks for joining us here again on Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks, Donegan.
Hey, Reluctant Preppers, if you want to hear more bonus footage from other guests we've had on, come on over right now to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and access that bonus footage there. Take care.
It seems so hard to order. Who can I trust, and how do I even start?
Oh, you just go to sdbullion.com/rp, pick out whatever gold or silver you want, add it to your cart, you can check out, and it's on its way. And they're A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau.
Wow, it's that easy?
Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp.
After I order gold or silver, how can I trust I'm going to get it? And I don't want everybody to know that I'm ordering gold and silver.
Oh, it's okay. It's fully insured, it's trackable, and you have to sign for it, so nobody else is going to get it but you. And it comes discreetly packaged. If you order a small amount, like maybe gold, it'll probably come in a box that looks something like this.
Okay.
And if you order a large amount, maybe like silver, it'll come in a box that looks something like this.
Wow.
But it doesn't say gold or silver on there. It might say something industrial or something else like that, but nobody's going to know what you ordered.
Oh, that's great to know.
Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp.
If I own gold or silver, how will I ever be able to spend it?
Oh, sure. Well, consider good times or bad times. Like in good times, you can sell it back to the same place you bought it from. sdbullion.com/rp will buy it back at the best price guaranteed on the internet. You can take it to a local coin shop and get cash in your hand, completely anonymous. Some people you know may be willing to take gold or silver coins in exchange for goods or services. Now, in bad times, when things have really fallen apart, time after time in history, people have found that in hard times, gold and silver really does come through as something that people recognize as value even after everything else has failed. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp.
What if gold or silver drop in price after I order it?
Well, everything fluctuates with time, but nothing is held up longer and better than gold and silver throughout all the changes that have happened in history. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp.
What good does gold do me anyway? I can't use it for anything.
Well, I think I found a form you might appreciate.
Wow. That's beautiful. Wow, I can wear that just about anywhere.
And you can take it with you through airport security and across borders. It's small and compact and lightweight, and you can even hand it down through generations. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp. Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.